Still, the chandelier light trembled over the Christmas table as my son told me to get out of my own seat. As I kept my hand on the chair, I straightened my back, choosing silence over shock in front of my family. While the same light burned down on us, I heard the slap land and felt warmth rise in my cheek, not my voice. The same chandelier glow reflected off the china, reminding me how carefully I'd built everything for him. That's when I realized the betrayal wasn't the strike. It was the son who no longer saw his father. Still, under that light, I decided love wouldn't excuse this, but consequences would remember it. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. The Christmas table gleamed under the soft glow of the chandelier. John stood at the head, surveying the scene like a proud general overlooking a well-ordered battlefield. His home, a large, upscale house nestled in the heart of suburban Pennsylvania, was a picture of holiday perfection. The finest china sparkled, the centerpiece was a towering arrangement of winter flowers, and the sweet smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon spiced the air. The fire crackled in the background, its warmth contrasting with the cold world outside. This was his moment, his family gathered together for what should have been a joyous Christmas dinner. He'd worked hard to build this life, this legacy. Yet, as his eyes drifted across the table, something about the atmosphere didn't sit right. His wife, Lily, smiled warmly beside him, her face glowing with pride, but John's attention shifted to his son, Ryan, who sat directly across the table. Ryan was trying to seem normal. His smile was a little too wide, his laughter a bit too forced. It was clear to John that something was off. Beneath the surface of Ryan's polite small talk, there was a coldness, a distance that had grown between them in the past year. John had always prided himself on being a good provider, a dedicated father, but lately, Ryan's indifference felt like a slap in the face. Mia, Ryan's wife, sat at the far end of the table, her attention flickering between Ryan and her father, Samuel. The older man sat there with his customary air of authority, stoic, composed, always the center of attention. John couldn't help but notice how often Ryan's eyes darted over to Samuel, seeking his approval, his guidance. It stung. The man had been a constant presence in Ryan's life, and John had never quite been able to shake the feeling that Samuel, a successful businessman in his own right, had somehow come to overshadow him. A knot twisted in John's stomach. He didn't want to admit it, but the thought gnawed at him. Was he losing his son to Samuel? He had always been there, pushing Ryan to succeed, to take over the family business, to become a man worthy of the legacy he'd built. And yet, now it seemed as though Ryan was looking elsewhere for validation, away from his father's shadow. Trying to shake off the feeling, John made a conscious effort to focus on the conversation. He raised his glass, offering a toast to family, to health, to prosperity. His words felt hollow even as they left his lips. The smiles around the table seemed forced, except for Samuel, who nodded in approval, as though John's words had been carefully chosen for his audience. John smiled tightly, raising his glass to the man who had clearly assumed a role in his son's life that John had never intended to relinquish. He quickly averted his gaze, focusing instead on Ryan, hoping for a flicker of the warmth they once shared. But Ryan's eyes were elsewhere. His conversation with Mia seemed strained, the tension between them palpable. It wasn't just the father-in-law's presence, it was something deeper, something that John couldn't quite put his finger on. The evening wore on, the clink of silverware against porcelain, the hum of polite conversation filling the air. But for John, it all felt distant, like he was watching the scene unfold from the other side of a glass wall. He smiled when appropriate, joined in the laughter when it felt right, but the sense of unease lingered, settling like an uncomfortable weight in his chest. As the meal came to a close and dessert was served, John couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. Something in Ryan. Something in the way he looked at Samuel, in the way he avoided his father's gaze. John tried to ignore the tightening in his chest, telling himself that it was just the pressure of the holidays, that he was reading too much into things. But as the evening stretched on, he couldn't help but feel it. His family was slipping away, piece by piece, and he wasn't sure how to stop it. The night was far from over, but already John couldn't help but wonder what had happened to the bond he once shared with his son. The evening had started out so perfectly. The clink of glasses, the warmth of the fire crackling in the hearth, and the lingering hum of Christmas carols seemed to promise an unforgettable holiday. John had hoped for nothing more than to enjoy a quiet evening with his family. He glanced at the clock. It was getting late, but the night was far from over. He had just finished telling a funny story, and now he casually patted the seat next to him, signaling for Ryan to join him at the head of the table. Ryan, who had been fidgeting with his silverware and avoiding eye contact for most of the night, paused. There was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes before he snapped. "This seat is for my father-in-law. Get out." The words hit John like a physical blow, sharp and unexpected. His hand, still hovering over the edge of the chair, froze. For a moment he couldn't process what had just happened. He blinked, unsure if he had heard him correctly. Was Ryan joking? Surely this was some kind of mistake. But no, Ryan's expression was cold, his face a mask of something between frustration and contempt. The room went deathly silent. Every single person at the table stopped mid-motion, eyes darting between John and Ryan. Mia's fork fell onto her plate with a soft clang, her face turning pale as she looked from her husband to her father. Ethan, John's younger son, stiffened in his seat, his eyes wide with disbelief. And Lily, sitting beside John, looked as though she might faint. John, still struggling to grasp what had just been said, finally found his voice. "Ryan, what the hell is this about? Why are you—" Before he could finish, Ryan's hand shot out, the slap ringing through the room with such force that it felt like time had stopped. John's head whipped to the side, his cheek burning from the sting of it, his ears buzzing with shock. The taste of copper flooded his mouth as he struggled to comprehend the sudden violence. Mia's face twisted in horror, her hands shaking as she reached out toward Ryan. "Ryan, stop! What are you doing?" she cried, but it was too late. Ryan had already pushed his chair back and stood up, his anger so palpable it felt like it was suffocating the air around them. John, still reeling, remained frozen in place, his face flushed from both the slap and the humiliation. The sting on his cheek was nothing compared to the weight of betrayal crashing down on him. He had never been so publicly disrespected. The Christmas dinner, his dinner, had turned into a battlefield, and the person who had just struck him was his own flesh and blood. Ryan didn't say another word. He turned on his heel and stormed out of the room, the door slamming behind him with a finality that made the entire house feel like it was shaking. Mia, visibly shaken, tried to stand, but her legs wobbled as if she could barely hold herself up. I'm so sorry, John," she whispered, her voice breaking. She didn't know what to do, caught between the husband she feared and the father she wanted to protect. The silence that followed was suffocating. No one moved. No one dared to speak. Ethan sat frozen in his chair, his eyes wide with confusion. Lily, who had been John's steady partner through everything, simply stared ahead, unable to find the words to console him. John, still numb from the blow, slowly reached up to touch his cheek, his fingers trembling slightly. The sting was fading, but the shock remained, gnawing at him. What had just happened? How had things gotten so out of control so quickly? His mind raced, but the words eluded him. His son had just slapped him publicly, with no provocation, and in front of everyone. The pride he had always carried in his heart felt like it had been ripped away, leaving a raw, gaping wound in its place. As the seconds ticked by, the house remained still. The Christmas decorations, once symbols of family warmth, now felt hollow, like cruel reminders of how quickly a perfect evening could unravel. John finally broke the silence, his voice barely a whisper. What the hell just happened? But no one could answer. And as the realization of what Ryan had done began to sink in, one thought kept echoing in John's mind. What had driven his son to this? John sat motionless at the head of the table, his body still, though his mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened. His cheek still burned from the slap, a raw, stinging reminder of his son's public rejection, but the pain was nothing compared to the emptiness settling inside him. The once warm, festive atmosphere had vanished, leaving only a cold, oppressive silence. His breath was shallow, his pulse erratic as he tried to grasp the enormity of the moment. Was this really happening? Was this how his family had fractured? Clara was the first to move, her footsteps soft but urgent as she rushed to his side, kneeling down beside him. "John," she said, her voice trembling. She reached for his hand, her touch gentle but firm. "Are you all right?" Her eyes were filled with concern, but John barely noticed. He could pull his gaze from the empty chair, where Ryan had been sitting only moments before. The room felt like it had frozen in time. Mia, standing at the opposite end of the table, hesitated before she made her way toward John. Her face was pale, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as if to steady herself. "John," she began, her voice soft, apologetic, but somehow distant. "I'm so sorry. I don't know why he did that. I don't understand what's gotten into him." John didn't respond. He couldn't. The apology, no matter how sincere it sounded, felt hollow. It didn't make sense. How could Ryan, his son, the one he had worked so hard for, the one he had sacrificed so much for, lash out like this, in front of everyone at Christmas dinner of all times? The weight of the slap was still there, but it was the humiliation, the sense of betrayal that dug deeper. Mia's apology didn't touch it. Nothing could. Ethan, John's younger son, stood at the edge of the room, looking between his parents and Ryan's empty chair. He looked lost, confused. "Dad, why would Ryan do that?" he asked, his voice cracking with disbelief. "What? What happened?" The question lingered in the air, unanswered. John shook his head slowly, still processing. He didn't have an answer for Ethan. How could he? He had no idea what had pushed Ryan to such an extreme, and it made him question everything. His mind flashed back to the years spent working long hours, prioritizing his business, his success, over time with his children. Was this his fault? Had he been so consumed by his career that he missed the cracks forming in his relationship with Ryan? Had he neglected his own son, so focused on building an empire that he forgot to nurture the most important thing, his family? Clara's voice brought him back to the present. "John," she said, her hand still holding his, "this isn't just about the slap. This has been building up for a while, hasn't it? There's something deeper going on with Ryan." John didn't respond at first. His eyes were fixed on the floor as if searching for something he couldn't find. He couldn't answer Clara's question either. He wasn't sure what was happening anymore. All he knew was that his relationship with Ryan had never felt so fragile. He'd always been the one in control, the one who had all the answers, the one who fixed things. But this felt beyond repair. The tension in the room thickened, and John's gaze finally shifted to the corner where Samuel stood. The older man had been silent throughout the entire scene, but now he watched John with a look that was almost knowing, his expression unreadable. Samuel, Ryan's father-in-law, the man who had always held a kind of quiet power in the family, hadn't moved, hadn't offered any comfort, any explanation. But there was something in his eyes, a faint trace of something that made John's stomach turn. A knowing look. Almost as if he understood something John didn't. John's heart sank. What did Samuel know? What had been happening behind the scenes that he had missed? Had Samuel been feeding into this rift, encouraging Ryan to distance himself from him? The questions began to pile up, and with each one, the weight of his son's betrayal grew heavier. "Is this it?" John thought, feeling the sting of the slap in his chest once again. "Is this the end of everything we built?" He couldn't help but wonder if he'd already lost Ryan, if the damage was irreversible. And as the silence stretched on, filled only with the crackle of the fire and the distant hum of his own thoughts, one question echoed louder than the rest. Was this the beginning of the end? The morning after the slap, the house was eerily quiet. The festive decorations that had once filled the home with warmth now felt like cruel reminders of the chaos that had unfolded the night before. John sat in his study, the weight of last night's events still pressing on his chest. He couldn't shake the image of Ryan's cold expression, the slap, the humiliation. How had it come to this? What had driven his son to act so violently in front of everyone? The clock on the wall ticked louder than it ever had before, and John's thoughts raced in circles. He knew he had to confront Ryan, had to understand what had happened, what had pushed him over the edge. He wasn't sure how, or even if, he could repair their relationship, but the uncertainty gnawed at him. He couldn't let this linger, not after everything they had been through. John found Ryan sitting alone in the kitchen, staring out the window at the snow-covered yard. His posture was tense, as though the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. Ryan didn't even look up when John entered the room, and for a moment, John stood there unsure how to begin. He had always been the one in control, always had the answers, always the strong one in the family. But today he felt small. "Ryan," John's voice was steady, but the tightness in his throat betrayed his inner turmoil. "We need to talk." Ryan's shoulders stiffened. He didn't turn to face John, but his voice was cold, clipped. "What's there to talk about?" John felt a flash of anger, but he fought to keep it in check. "You slapped me in front of the entire family, Ryan. I don't know why, but I need to understand. You owe me that much." Ryan's silence hung in the air like an unspoken challenge. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke, his tone distant, almost devoid of emotion. "I didn't mean to humiliate you. I just couldn't take it anymore." John's brow furrowed, the words hanging in the air, heavy with meaning. "Take what, Ryan?" Ryan finally turned to face him, his eyes cold and unwavering. "I've always felt like I'm living in your shadow, Dad. Everything I do, every decision I make, it's always been about you, about what you want, what you think is best." His voice grew bitter, each word laced with frustration. "I've spent my whole life trying to be good enough for you, trying to follow in your footsteps. But I'm tired, Dad, tired of feeling like I'm never enough." John's chest tightened. His son's words cut deeper than any slap ever could. He had known Ryan was distant, but he hadn't realized how deep that distance went, how suffocating his presence had become in his son's life. "You think I've been holding you back?" John asked, his voice faltering. Ryan took a breath, then dropped a bombshell that left John reeling. "It's not just you, it's Samuel too. He's been mentoring me, giving me advice, guiding me. He's shown me that I don't have to follow your path, that I can make my own way." Ryan's eyes darkened, the weight of his words sinking in. "He's helped me see how much you've been controlling everything. I don't need your approval, Dad. I need to do this for me." John felt the room close in around him. Samuel, Ryan's father-in-law, the man who had always held a quiet, subtle influence over their lives, had been pushing Ryan away from him. It was a shock to John's core. He had always been competitive with Samuel, but never had he imagined that the man had been quietly undermining him, feeding Ryan's insecurities. John's heart sank, the crushing realization washing over him. "So this is about him?" he asked quietly. "Samuel has been turning you against me." Ryan's gaze softened, but there was no apology in his eyes, only a deep sadness. "No, Dad, it's not just about him, it's about me. I feel like a failure compared to you. You've built this empire, this legacy, and I'm just your son. I've spent my whole life trying to be something I'm not. I can't live under your shadow anymore." The weight of Ryan's words hit John like a ton of bricks. For the first time, he realized it wasn't the money, the inheritance, or the business that was at the root of Ryan's anger. It was something much deeper. It was about feeling inadequate, unworthy of the life his father had built for him. John's throat tightened, the bitter sting of failure cutting through him. Was this his fault? Had he been so focused on building his business, on creating something monumental, that he had neglected the one thing that truly mattered, his relationship with his son? Had he spent so many years thinking of Ryan as his legacy, as an extension of himself, that he had forgotten to see him as his own person? A cold emptiness filled John as he tried to find the words. But he couldn't. His mind raced, but his heart was heavy with grief. Had he ever truly been a father to Ryan, or had he just been a figure of authority, a distant ideal of what Ryan was supposed to be? Ryan turned to leave, but before he did, he looked over his shoulder, his voice softer now, but still laced with resolve. "I don't know what to do anymore, Dad, but I have to find my own way." And with that he walked out, leaving John alone, staring after him, lost in the silence that seemed to fill the space between them. The truth had been laid bare, but it only created more questions. And as John sat there, the weight of it all pressing down on him, he wondered if he had already lost his son for good. John arrived at the small cafe where he had arranged to meet Samuel, his heart pounding with a mix of anger and dread. The air was thick with anticipation as he stepped inside, scanning the room. Samuel was already there, sitting at a corner table with a calm, almost detached expression, as if he had been expecting this conversation for weeks. John's pulse quickened as he approached, the weight of the confrontation settling heavily on his shoulders. "Samuel," John said, his voice controlled but laced with underlying tension, "we need to talk." Samuel didn't look up immediately. He took his time, finishing the sip of coffee he'd been nursing before setting the cup down with deliberate slowness. "I figured this was coming," he said, finally meeting John's eyes with a measured look. "Sit down, John. Let's get this over with." John sat down across from him, his gaze hard. "You've been mentoring Ryan, haven't you?" he asked, his words clipped. "You've been pushing him away from me. I want to know why." Samuel leaned back in his chair, his hands folding neatly in front of him. There was no guilt in his posture, no hesitation. "Ryan needs to be his own man," he said, his voice cool and firm. "You've done enough, John. He spent his whole life living in your shadow and it stifled him. He's never had the chance to figure out who he really is." John's chest tightened with a rush of anger. "Stifled him," he repeated, his voice rising slightly. "I gave him everything, a life, a future, everything I've done for him. And you think I've stifled him?" The words felt like they were choking him. He had always thought he was doing what was best for Ryan. Had it all been wrong? Samuel's gaze never wavered, his expression unchanging. "What you gave him, John, was your version of success, your idea of a future, not his. He spent years trying to live up to your expectations, and it's been killing him." "That's not your call to make," John snapped, leaning forward, his voice a low growl. "You've been manipulating him. You've been planting seeds in his mind, encouraging him to distance himself from me. Why?" Samuel didn't flinch, didn't even seem fazed by John's outburst. "I'm not manipulating him, John. I'm offering him guidance. I see potential in Ryan. He's a smart, capable young man, and he deserves to take control of his own future, free from your shadow." The words hit John like a slap. The realization crashed over him like a wave, pulling the ground out from under him. Samuel hadn't just been advising Ryan. He had been undermining John's entire existence, not just as a father, but as a man. Samuel had been quietly positioning himself as Ryan's true mentor, pushing him away from the very family he had spent his life trying to build. The betrayal cut deeper than anything John had felt before. "You've been doing this all along, haven't you?" John's voice cracked slightly, a mix of grief and fury. "Undermining me. Slowly, subtly, until Ryan was so far gone that he'd rather listen to you than his own father." Samuel met John's gaze, unflinching. "I haven't undermined you, John. I've only tried to help Ryan see that there's more than one way to live a life. You've built an empire, but that's not the only thing worth living for." John felt a weight settle on his chest. He couldn't argue with Samuel's words. They had a certain truth to them, a bitter truth that stung. But it didn't make it any easier to accept. His mind raced with questions, with anger, with a deep, gnawing sense of loss. How had he let this happen? How had he let Samuel slip into his son's life, taking a place that should have been his? The silence between them grew heavy, and John stood up abruptly, the sharpness of his movements betraying the storm inside him. "I need to go," he said, his voice hard. "But don't think for a second that I'm going to forgive you for this, or for what you've done to my son." Samuel didn't respond. He just watched John leave, his eyes unreadable. John walked out of the cafe, the cold air hitting his face like a slap. He felt more lost than ever, as if the ground had been ripped out from under him. His son, his own flesh and blood, was slipping away. And the man responsible, the one who had subtly dismantled everything John had tried to build, was still standing in the shadows, untouched. John didn't know what to do next, but one thing was clear: this was far from over. And as he walked away from Samuel, he couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The weight of the confrontation with Samuel pressed down on John as he sat alone in his study, the walls of the room seeming to close in on him. His mind was a storm of thoughts, each one heavier than the last. He had always known that his relationship with Ryan was fragile, but he had never imagined it would unravel like this. Samuel's words echoed in his head, a constant reminder of how far he had drifted from the son he had once thought he understood. Clara entered the room, her footsteps soft but determined. She knew something was wrong, she always did, but the strain between them made it harder to talk. "John," she said gently, her voice carrying the weight of years of shared history, "you can't let this destroy you. We have to find a way to fix things with Ryan." John didn't answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the window, where the world outside seemed oblivious to the turmoil inside. He could hear Clara's words, but they felt distant, as if they were being spoken to someone else, not him. Fix things? Could they even be fixed? "I don't know if it's possible," he finally muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "It feels like everything's falling apart, Clara. I don't know if I can reach Ryan anymore. I don't know if I can fix what's been broken." Clara stepped closer, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. "You're his father, he's your son. There has to be a way." But as John sat there, the anger, the hurt, and the betrayal still roiling within him, he couldn't help but wonder if Clara was right. He had spent so many years chasing success, consumed by his business, by his need to leave behind a legacy. And in doing so, had he lost his family? Had he sacrificed his relationship with Ryan for the sake of building an empire, never seeing the toll it was taking? The thought hit him like a physical blow. He had always told himself he was doing this for them, for Ryan, for Clara. But had he been too blinded by ambition to notice what they really needed? Had Ryan always felt like he was living in his father's shadow, never able to carve out his own path? The realization made John's stomach turn. As if on cue, his phone buzzed on the desk in front of him. He picked it up, his heart sinking when he saw Ryan's name on the screen. He hadn't heard from his son since the Christmas dinner, and he didn't know what to expect. The message was short, but the weight of it hung heavy. "Dad, I'm sorry. I was wrong. Can we talk?" John stared at the screen for a long time, the words dancing in front of his eyes but not quite making it through the haze of his emotions. He wanted to believe Ryan. He wanted to believe that this was his son finally coming to his senses, realizing how deeply he had hurt him. But after everything, the slap, the betrayal, the way Samuel had been subtly poisoning Ryan's mind, John couldn't bring himself to trust so easily. Clara's voice broke through his thoughts again. "Ryan needs time, John. We all do. You can't fix everything in one day." Mia's words from earlier also echoed in his mind. Ryan needs time to figure things out on his own. Mia had been right in her own way. Maybe this was about more than just forgiveness. It was about giving Ryan the space to come to terms with his own choices, to find his own way without the pressure of living up to anyone else's expectations, even his father's. But as John sat there, torn between his hurt and his love for his son, he realized that time might not be enough. Maybe the healing would take more than just waiting for things to settle. It might take something harder, something more painful. It might take letting go of his pride, letting go of the control he had so carefully built up over the years. John finally stood, his movements slow, deliberate. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't even know if he could fix what had been broken. But he couldn't just let Ryan go, not without trying. Not after everything. He took a deep breath, a quiet resolve settling over him. "I'll give him one last chance," he said, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of his decision. "But I can't do this alone. He needs to meet me halfway." As he looked out the window once again, a wave of uncertainty washed over him. Could Ryan really change? Could their relationship ever be repaired? He didn't know. But he knew one thing for certain. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, and it might cost him more than he was ready to give. But for the first time in a long while, he was willing to try. John arrived at the small, quiet cafe, the kind that always felt like a refuge from the world outside. He hadn't been here in years, but today it felt right. Neutral ground, away from the weight of his home and the suffocating memories of the past few days. He had agreed to meet Ryan here, to finally face him, to confront the raw wound that had been left by the slap and the betrayals that followed. The cafe was nearly empty, save for a few scattered patrons, their murmurs lost in the soft jazz playing in the background. Ryan was already seated at a table by the window, his eyes downcast, fingers nervously tapping on the rim of his coffee cup. When John walked in, Ryan looked up, his face pale, his eyes swollen as if he hadn't slept. He looked like a man who had been through more than just a confrontation with his father. "Sit down, Dad," Ryan said quietly, his voice thick with regret. He stopped himself as if the words were difficult to find. "I'm sorry, I know I've screwed everything up." John sat down across from him, his jaw tight. The anger was still there, simmering beneath the surface. How could it not be? The pain of the slap, the humiliation in front of the whole family, it had all cut so deep. But now, looking at Ryan, there was something else. A deeper hurt. A heartache that came from the realization that his son, the boy he had loved and raised, was no longer the person he had thought he was. "You humiliated me, Ryan," John said, his voice low but firm. "In front of everyone, my own son. Slapping me like that. You've broken more than just a moment, Ryan. You've broken trust." Ryan's face flushed with shame, his eyes dropping to the table. I don't know what I was thinking. It was a huge mistake. And his voice caught in his throat, and for a moment, John saw the vulnerability bend. The anger. I didn't realize what it would cost. I didn't see the damage I was doing until it was too late. John clenched his fists under the table, the fury still fresh. "You didn't realize. How could you not realize, Ryan? You think this is just about money, about the inheritance." His voice rose slightly, the words spilling out before he could stop them. "No, it's not about that. It's about trust. You've destroyed it." Ryan's eyes welled with tears, but he fought them back. "I didn't mean to hurt you like that. I just didn't know how to deal with everything. Samuel, he told me things. I let him get in my head and I pushed you away because I thought I had to, but I see now. I see how wrong I was." John's heart ached at Ryan's words, but the damage had already been done. "You've done more than just hurt me, Ryan. You've made me question everything. All these years. All the things I did for you, thinking I was doing the right thing. And now, I don't even know who you are anymore." Ryan reached across the table, his hands trembling. "Please, Dad, don't say that. I want to make it right. I want us to fix this. I know I've messed up, but I want to rebuild. I need to rebuild." His voice was desperate now, raw with emotion. John looked at him, the words stuck in his throat. He wanted to forgive him, wanted to believe that this was the turning point, that they could heal. But he had to be honest with himself. Trust wasn't something that could be patched up overnight, and Ryan had shattered it in a way that couldn't easily be fixed. "I'll try," John said finally, his voice quieter, the anger now mixed with something else. "But it's not going to be easy. You've hurt me, Ryan, and trust isn't something that just comes back with an apology. You'll have to prove to me that you can be the son I thought you were, because right now I don't know if I can believe in you again." Ryan's eyes darkened, and for a moment it seemed like he was about to say something more. But instead, he slammed his hand against the table, the noise sharp in the quiet space between them. "I've tried to do everything you wanted. I've tried to live up to your damn expectations, and look where that got me." His voice cracked, and he stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Maybe it's too late, maybe I am too far gone. Maybe this." He waved his hand between them, as if gesturing to the brokenness of everything. "This is where we end." John watched as Ryan stormed out, his heart pounding, a knot in his chest. There was no apology now, no more remorse, just an angry, lost boy who seemed as uncertain as John himself. And as John sat there, the weight of everything pressing down on him, he couldn't help but feel the truth settle in. Some family ties could never be fully repaired. Alone in the cafe, John sat in the silence, staring at the door Ryan had just walked through. Was this really the end? And if it was, how could he move forward from this? The weight of the past few months had been heavy on John's shoulders, but today, something felt different. He had been watching Ryan closely ever since their last confrontation, wondering if his son's promises to change were genuine. The anger and betrayal still burned in John's chest, but he had made the decision to give Ryan a chance. A small chance, but a chance nonetheless. It wasn't easy. Every instinct told him to hold back, to protect himself from further disappointment. But a part of him, perhaps the part that had once believed in his son without question, still hoped. "Ryan," John said, meeting his son in the family office, the space that had once felt like a battlefield but now seemed like an unlikely place for reconciliation. "I'm giving you a chance. You can take on a small responsibility here in the business, just a few projects, but this is on you to prove that you can handle it, that you can rebuild the trust you've shattered." Ryan's eyes flickered with a mix of surprise and something deeper, relief perhaps. He nodded without hesitation, his voice urgent, almost desperate. "Thank you, Dad. I won't let you down, I swear." John watched as Ryan walked away, determination written all over his face. There was something different about him now, something more grounded, more earnest, but John wasn't ready to trust it. Not yet. He had seen this before, seen the promises, the sincerity, the promises that always turned out to be empty. The weeks that followed were a strange mix of tension and cautious optimism. Ryan threw himself into his work with an intensity John hadn't seen in years. He was on time for meetings, he followed through on every task, and for the first time in a long time, John found himself impressed. The old Ryan, the one who was always distracted, always looking for shortcuts, seemed to have disappeared. In his place was a version of Ryan who seemed determined to prove himself. But John, despite the change, remained guarded. How could he not? His son had betrayed him in the worst possible way. How could one small gesture be enough to repair that? One afternoon, as John sat in his office, reviewing some documents, his phone buzzed with an incoming call. He didn't recognize the number, but the moment he picked up, he knew who it was. Samuel. "John," Samuel's voice came through the phone, smooth as ever but with a tension beneath it that made John's skin crawl. "I've been thinking about Ryan. He's been doing better, hasn't he? You must be proud." John's grip tightened on the phone. "What do you want, Samuel?" he growled. "I'm not in the mood for games." Samuel chuckled softly. "No games, John, just a little advice. Ryan is finally stepping up, and I think it would be wise to give him more than just small projects. You know he has potential. You've always known that. Why not give him more responsibility, more of the business?" John's jaw clenched. Samuel's influence was still there, hovering like a shadow even after everything. "I'm giving him a chance," John said, his voice low. "But I don't need your advice. Not now, not after everything." Samuel's voice dropped slightly, but it was still smooth, almost manipulative. "I'm just saying. You should think about it. If he's truly turning around, you might want to reward that. You don't want to lose him again, do you?" John slammed the phone down, fury rising in him. Samuel was at it again, trying to worm his way back into Ryan's head, trying to get him to follow his lead. It made John sick, but it also made him realize something. Ryan had come a long way, but the battle wasn't over, not by a long shot. That evening, John called Ryan into his office. The air was thick with anticipation as they sat across from each other, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Finally, John spoke. "I've been thinking about what you've done," he said, his voice steady but heavy. "And I'm willing to give you more. I'll allow you access to a portion of your inheritance. But there's a condition. This isn't a free pass. You have to prove you can manage it. You have to prove you've learned from the past." Ryan's eyes widened, disbelief flashing across his face. "Dad, He stopped, blinking, his voice faltering. "I didn't expect this. Thank you, I'll honor it. I swear I'll work to rebuild what I've ruined." John nodded, but the relief he saw in Ryan's face didn't quiet the unease in his chest. The past had a way of lingering, of creeping up when you least expected it. And there was still one thing John couldn't ignore. "Ryan," John said, his voice more serious now, "there's something I need to know. Are you still working with Samuel? Are you still letting him influence you?" Ryan hesitated, his eyes flickering with uncertainty. He opened his mouth to speak, but for a moment nothing came out. Finally, he admitted, "I've been working on a business idea with him. It's nothing, Dad. Just some advice he's been giving me." John's heart sank. He wanted to believe Ryan, wanted to trust that he was moving forward, but Samuel's influence still loomed large, like a shadow over everything. John stood, his expression hardening. "You need to make a choice, Ryan. You can't have both. You can't keep turning to him and expect me to trust you, not after everything." Ryan stood too, the weight of his father's words sinking in. But before he could respond, John turned and walked out of the office, his mind a storm of thoughts. The road ahead was uncertain, and though Ryan was trying to change, John couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was far from over. The revelation hit John like a punch to the gut. Ryan, his son, the one he had been trying so hard to rebuild a relationship with, had been working with Samuel all along. It wasn't just a business idea, it was a partnership. Samuel had been quietly pulling the strings, weaving his influence into Ryan's decisions. The shock of it was too much to bear. John sat at the kitchen table, his hands clenched around the coffee mug in front of him, but the warmth of the drink didn't reach his cold, heavy heart. His mind raced with a torrent of thoughts, betrayal, anger, confusion. After everything they had gone through, after everything John had sacrificed for Ryan, this was how it had turned out. How could Ryan do this to him? And how could Samuel? John had never fully trusted the man, but now it seemed like his suspicions had been more than justified. Clara walked into the kitchen, her expression soft but serious. She knew something was wrong. She could see it in his eyes, the raw pain of a man who felt like he had been blindsided by the people he loved most. "John," she said, sitting down across from him, "I know this is hard, but you have to remember, Ryan's making progress. He's trying. You have to focus on that." John shook his head, the frustration building within him. "Progress? Clara, he's been lying to me this entire time, working with Samuel behind my back. This isn't just a mistake, this is a betrayal." Clara reached across the table, her hand resting gently on his. "I know, but he's also trying to change. He's admitted that he was wrong. He's apologized. You can't erase that with one mistake." John stared at her, but his heart was heavy with doubt. Could he really let go of the anger and distrust? Could he forgive his son for this? For letting Samuel, of all people, get so deeply involved in his life? It felt like the past months of progress had been a lie. The door creaked open and Ryan walked in, his expression uncertain. He could feel the tension in the air, the silence that had settled between father and son. He stood there for a moment, unsure of how to approach the situation before finally speaking. "Dad, I'm sorry. I should have told you about Samuel. I was just trying to make my own way, to stand on my own feet." John didn't look up, his jaw tightening as he absorbed Ryan's words. He wanted to believe him. He wanted to believe that Ryan had been trying to carve out his own path, separate from his father's shadow. But the truth was too raw, too fresh. "You were trying to make your own way, or were you trying to replace me?" John's voice cracked, the pain of betrayal evident in every syllable. "You've always had everything you needed from me, Ryan. I gave you everything. But you went to Samuel of all people. How could you do that?" Ryan's face contorted with guilt, and for a moment, John saw the young man who had once looked up to him, who had trusted him without question. "I never wanted to replace you," Ryan said, his voice shaking. I was trying to figure out who I am, and I thought maybe Samuel could help me see that. But now I see that I've made a huge mistake." John's chest tightened as he listened to his son's words, but the wound was still too fresh, too deep. He couldn't help but wonder, could the trust between them ever be fully repaired? Ryan seemed to sense the doubt in his father's silence. "I've been thinking about Samuel, Dad. I thought he was just giving me advice, but now I'm starting to realize it wasn't just advice. He had his own agenda. He wanted me to distance myself from you. He wanted to take me away from everything you've built." John's heart skipped a beat at Ryan's admission. Finally, for the first time, Ryan was seeing Samuel for what he truly was, a man who had been trying to control him, to manipulate him. But was it too little, too late? John took a deep breath, the weight of everything pressing down on him. "I'm not sure what to do with this, Ryan. I don't know if I can just forget all the ways you've hurt me." Ryan's voice wavered with sincerity. "I understand, Dad. I know I've broken your trust, but I swear to you I want to make things right. I want to prove that I'm capable of earning your trust again." John stood up slowly, his eyes meeting Ryan's. "This isn't going to be easy, but I'll give you another chance. I'll help you, but don't mistake my willingness to try for forgiveness. You've got to show me that you can be the man I always thought you were, and you've got to prove that Samuel isn't a part of that." Ryan nodded, his eyes filled with determination. "I will, I promise, Dad. I'll do whatever it takes." John stood there for a moment, staring at his son, unsure of what the future would hold. The road ahead was uncertain, and though he had agreed to give Ryan another chance, the scars from the past would take time to heal. And as Ryan turned to leave, John couldn't shake the feeling that, despite the promises and the apologies, the real test had only just begun. John sat in his office, the weight of the past few months still pressing down on him, but today was different. For the first time in a long while, he found himself thinking about a future with Ryan, a future that might not be filled with resentment or betrayal, but with something resembling trust. Ryan had worked hard to prove himself since their last conversation, and as difficult as it had been for John to admit, there was a part of him that believed his son was trying to change. It was a fragile belief, one that could easily be shattered, but John wasn't ready to give up on him. Not yet. "Ryan," John said, leaning back in his chair, his voice steady but filled with an undertone of uncertainty. "I'm willing to give you more responsibility in the business. You'll take on a larger role, but this time it's not just about following orders. I need to see commitment. I need to know you're ready to carry the weight of this family's legacy." Ryan's eyes lit up with a mixture of hope and relief. He had been waiting for this moment, but even now, after everything, he couldn't shake the weight of his past mistakes. "Thank you, Dad," he said, his voice earnest. "I won't let you down. I know I have a lot to prove." John nodded, but there was a caution in his eyes. "You've made a lot of promises, Ryan. Prove it. Don't just talk about it, show me." The weeks that followed were filled with an intensity John hadn't seen from his son in years. Ryan worked harder than ever, arriving early, staying late, showing a level of focus and dedication that made John hesitate, just for a moment, on his decision to remain cautious. There was something different about him now. He was more serious, more aware of the gravity of what was at stake. He no longer spoke to John as if he was simply a father figure to be impressed, but as a partner to be respected. John could feel the change, even if he wasn't quite ready to believe it yet. But then, as quickly as Ryan had started to build that trust, something happened. One afternoon, as John was reviewing some financials in his office, he overheard Ryan's voice, a hushed conversation on the phone with none other than Samuel. His pulse quickened as he listened, the old anger flaring up again. He hadn't expected Samuel to disappear completely, but the fact that he was still offering advice to Ryan, still trying to worm his way into his son's decision-making, made John's stomach turn. He didn't interrupt the call, but the unease was back, heavier than before. Had Ryan really changed? Or was this just another play, a temporary shift before he returned to the same toxic patterns? Later that evening, as Ryan walked into John's office, he seemed more at ease, as though the weight of the world had shifted off his shoulders. But there was something in his eyes, a quiet determination that John hadn't seen before. "Dad, I've been thinking," Ryan began, sitting down across from him, his hands resting on the table. "I've decided I want to start something of my own, a project that's separate from the family business." John's heart skipped a beat, a mix of shock and concern tightening in his chest. "What do you mean, separate?" he asked, trying to mask his surprise with calm. "I want to build something that's mine," Ryan continued, his voice steady. "I've been so focused on living up to your expectations that I've lost sight of my own dreams. This isn't about leaving the family behind. It's about me taking responsibility for my own future." John leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming lightly on the armrest. The idea of Ryan stepping out on his own, away from the family's shadow, was a hard pill to swallow. He had spent years building this business with the hope that his sons would continue what he had started. But something about Ryan's words felt different this time. There was a seriousness in his eyes, a resolve that hadn't been there before. "I can't stop you from doing what you think is best for you," John said quietly. "But I need you to understand one thing, Ryan. Your future isn't just determined by what you inherit from me. It's determined by your actions. Prove to me that you're capable of standing on your own, that you can make it without the safety net of this business. That's what will matter in the end." Ryan nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I will, Dad, I promise. I know I've got a long way to go, but I'll do it. I'll earn your trust." John watched as Ryan left his office, the weight of his decision settling in. This was a new beginning, one that felt both hopeful and terrifying. There was still so much uncertainty, so much left to be proven. And yet, as John sat there, he couldn't shake the feeling that, despite the doubt still lingering in his chest, Ryan might finally be on the right path. But as the door closed behind his son, John couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in the back of his mind. Would this path lead to success, or would it tear them apart all over again? The future was uncertain, and though Ryan had promised to prove himself, John knew the hardest tests were still to come. Ryan stood at the edge of the bustling cafe, his phone pressed to his ear as he listened intently. The business he'd been dreaming of, the one that had driven him to pull away from everything he once knew, was starting to take shape. The pressure of it all, of making something real, something entirely his own, was mounting. He could feel the weight of expectation on his shoulders, not just from his father but from himself. He had been given a chance, and now he had to prove that he could rise to it. When the call ended, Ryan set the phone down on the table and ran a hand through his hair, trying to push away the tightness in his chest. His business was gaining momentum, but so was the fear that came with it. The fear of failing, of not being good enough. He had come so far, fought so hard to stand on his own, but now that he was truly moving forward, the pressure felt suffocating. "Everything okay?" John's voice came from behind him, warm but heavy with concern. Ryan turned around, his father's eyes searching his face for answers. The past few months had seen a fragile reconnection between them, but Ryan couldn't help but notice how the distance between them remained, how John's careful advice still carried the weight of authority, even when Ryan was trying so hard to make his own way. "I'm fine," Ryan said, forcing a smile. "Just a lot on my plate right now." He didn't want to admit it, but the truth was he was struggling. The work was harder than he had anticipated, and every decision felt like a step towards something, success or failure, he couldn't tell. John nodded, his gaze steady. "If you need guidance, I'm here. I know what it's like to carry the weight of a business. Don't hesitate to ask for help." Ryan hesitated, a part of him itching to accept his father's offer, but another part pushed it away. He wasn't the same person who had followed John's footsteps without question. He had made a promise to himself and to his father that he would stand on his own 2 feet, even if it meant struggling. "I appreciate it, Dad, but I need to figure this out on my own," Ryan replied, his voice a little sharper than he meant. "I need to make my own decisions now. I've been relying on you for too long." John's expression tightened, but he didn't push. He simply nodded, as if he understood, but Ryan could tell that it hurt him. The space between them seemed to grow wider with each step Ryan took toward independence, and it was a struggle to find the balance between his desire to prove himself and the loyalty he still felt to his father. As the weeks passed, Ryan threw himself deeper into his work, trying to prove that he was capable, that he could succeed on his own. But with that success came new challenges, challenges that made him question whether he had made the right choice in distancing himself from his family's business. One afternoon, as he sat in his small office, Ryan's phone buzzed. He glanced down at the screen. It was Samuel. His heart skipped a beat. Samuel had been a constant in his life, even though Ryan had tried to push him out. The man who had once been a mentor had never fully let go, always hovering on the edges, offering his advice, his investment. "Ryan," Samuel's voice crackled through the phone, "I've been hearing great things about your new venture. If you need a backer, I'm willing to invest. You know I believe in your potential." Ryan's fingers tightened around the phone, his heart racing. The offer was tempting. Samuel's money and influence would make things easier, quicker. But he had promised his father that he would stand on his own. "I don't know, Samuel," Ryan said, his voice betraying the uncertainty he felt. "I've been trying to do this on my own without your help." There was a pause on the other end of the line, a silence that stretched too long. "You can't do it alone, Ryan. You never could. Don't make the same mistake I did, by turning down a lifeline when it's right in front of you." The words hit him like a slap, and he could feel the pull, the old connection to Samuel, the man who had been there when Ryan felt lost, when he had been desperate for guidance. But Ryan knew, deep down, that he couldn't go back. He had to make this decision for himself, not for anyone else. Later that day, as Ryan sat in his father's office, the weight of his decision hung heavy between them. "Dad," he began, his voice steady but filled with the uncertainty he hadn't yet fully acknowledged. "I've been thinking a lot. Samuel offered to invest in my business, and I almost took him up on it, but I realized something. I don't want to keep relying on him. I need to do this on my own. I need to prove that I can." John's gaze softened, but there was still a trace of caution in his eyes. "It's a big step, Ryan. I'm proud of you for making this decision, but remember, this isn't just about pride. This is about building something that lasts." Ryan nodded, his heart finally easing, even if just a little. "I know. I'll prove it to you, Dad, to both of us." But even as Ryan spoke, a shadow of doubt lingered in his mind. Was he truly ready to walk this path alone? And as Samuel's influence seemed to fade into the background, Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest test was yet to come. Ryan sat at his desk, staring at the financial projections spread out in front of him, the numbers blurring together. His business was struggling. What had seemed like a promising start was now mired in unexpected setbacks, suppliers pulling out, unexpected costs, and a cash flow that was tighter than he had anticipated. The weight of it all pressed down on him like a vice. Every decision felt like it could be the tipping point. Every failure another blow to the fragile foundation he had worked so hard to build. The phone buzzed on his desk and he glanced down. It was a message from Samuel. "I know you're struggling, Ryan. I've been in your shoes. If you need help, I can offer you the financial backing to turn things around. Don't let pride get in the way. We both know what you need." Ryan's stomach twisted. He had promised himself and his father that he would never go back to relying on Samuel, but the temptation was undeniable. His pride told him to push through, to figure it out on his own. But the reality was more complicated. His business was on the brink of collapse, and Samuel's offer was a lifeline, one that would keep everything afloat at least for a while. Ryan rubbed his temples, the pressure mounting. He had worked too hard to let this fail. He had made promises, both to his father and himself, but as the days passed, those promises felt like fragile threads. Maybe this wasn't weakness. Maybe it was just the reality of trying to make it on his own. He needed the money. A few hours later, he found himself in a dimly lit restaurant booth, facing Samuel across the table. The man looked as calm and collected as ever, his eyes gleaming with the same calculating confidence that had always unnerved Ryan. "I knew you'd come around," Samuel said, his voice smooth, almost too reassuring. "This is the only way forward, Ryan, you know that. The money will buy you the time you need to get back on track. All I ask in return is that you let me help steer the ship." Ryan hesitated, his fingers tapping nervously against his cup. "I don't know. I promised I wouldn't go down this path again. I promised my father I'd figure this out on my own." Samuel leaned forward, his voice lowering. "I understand your hesitation, but think about it. You've already tried doing this alone. It's not working, Ryan. And you know as well as I do that without this help, everything you've worked for could fall apart." Ryan's mind raced, torn between his desire for independence and the crushing reality of failure. He had always resented Samuel's influence, but now, in the face of his own impending collapse, it felt like the only way out. "I'll help you," Samuel continued, his eyes sharp. "But there's one condition. If I invest, you'll need to distance yourself from your father completely. No more of his interference. He's been holding you back." Ryan's heart sank. The offer seemed too perfect, too tempting, but it came with a price he hadn't anticipated. Distance from his father, the very man who had tried in his own way to help him. It felt like betrayal. He left the meeting with a weight in his chest, the echo of Samuel's words haunting him. He had a decision to make, one that could destroy everything he had worked for, or at least everything he thought he wanted. The next day, John approached him in the office, his expression tight, sensing that something was wrong. "Ryan," John said, his voice a mix of concern and suspicion, "I heard you met with Samuel. Why are you once again considering his help after everything that's happened?" Ryan felt his chest tighten. The lie, the secret, pressed against him like a weight. He couldn't hide it anymore. "Dad," he began, his voice faltering, "I'm struggling. I need the money to make this work. I can't keep going like this." John's face fell, the hurt unmistakable in his eyes. "So that's it. You're willing to go back on your word after everything we've been through." Ryan looked away, unable to meet his father's gaze. "I didn't want to, but I don't know what else to do. I can't let this business fail. I need Samuel's help." John's voice dropped to a whisper, the devastation clear. "Ryan, you've learned nothing. After everything, after all the damage done, you're still willing to let Samuel control you." Ryan's heart broke at the accusation, but it wasn't until the words slipped from his lips that he truly understood the weight of what he was about to confess. "It's not just the money, Dad," he said, his voice hollow. "Samuel's offer. It comes with strings attached. He wants me to cut ties with you, completely. If I take the money, I have to distance myself from you." The silence that followed was unbearable. John stood frozen, his face a mask of shock and pain, the betrayal cutting deeper than Ryan had ever imagined. This wasn't just about business. It was about family, and Ryan was being torn apart by the very man he had tried to escape. John finally spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "So that's it, you've let him win, after everything." Ryan didn't know how to answer. He had made his choice, but he hadn't realized the cost until now. And as the weight of his decision crashed over him, he wondered if it was already too late to turn back. John stood in the doorway of the living room, the weight of the conversation hanging in the air. His anger simmered beneath the surface, a slow burn that had been building ever since Ryan admitted he was once again considering Samuel's help. The shock of his son's betrayal hadn't worn off. If anything, it had only deepened. He had fought so hard to rebuild their relationship, to offer Ryan a path forward. And now, it felt like everything he had done had been for nothing. Ryan, John's voice cracked as he stepped into the room, his hands clenched at his sides. After everything we've been through, after everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me. You're going to go back to Samuel, after everything he's done to us. Ryan's face fell, the words stinging more than he expected. He had hoped, perhaps naively, that his father would understand, or at least that he would accept the decision. But now, seeing the hurt in John's eyes, seeing the disappointment that cut deeper than any anger, Ryan realized just how much his choices had torn at the fabric of their bond. "I'm sorry, Dad," Ryan said quietly, his voice heavy with guilt. "I know I've hurt you, but I have to do what's best for me. I can't keep living in the shadow of everything you've built. I need to make my own way, to make my own decisions. This is my future." John's fists tightened, the pain of those words hitting him harder than he expected. "Your future," John repeated, the bitterness creeping into his voice. "You think that's what this is about? This isn't just about your future, Ryan. It's about loyalty. It's about family. And you're willing to throw all of that away for someone who has only ever used you." Ryan flinched at the accusation, but he couldn't bring himself to deny it. He had tried to be loyal. He had promised himself he wouldn't fall back into Samuel's grasp. But now, with the weight of his business falling apart and Samuel offering him a way out, he felt cornered. Wasn't this the only way to survive? John took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He didn't want to make any rash decisions, but his heart was heavy and his pride was bruised. "I don't know, Ryan. I don't know if I can keep doing this. Every time I try to give you a chance, you keep running back to him. I don't know if I can keep watching you destroy everything we've worked for." Clara, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped forward, her expression a mixture of concern and empathy. "John, I know you're hurt, but you can't give up on him now. He's struggling. We all are. You have to be patient. This isn't just about what Ryan does. It's about how you both move forward from here." John's eyes flicked to Clara, a soft sigh escaping him. "But what if I've already given too much? What if this is it, Clara? What if we can't fix this?" Clara placed a gentle hand on his arm, her voice steady. "Don't throw away everything for the sake of pride. He's your son, John. You've worked so hard to bring him back. Don't let one mistake ruin it all." Ryan, standing in the corner, listened in silence, guilt flooding him as he realized just how much damage he had caused. He had wanted to prove he could do it alone, but the truth was, he didn't want to lose his father. Could he really go through with cutting ties with the one person who had always been there for him? As the days passed, Ryan found himself at a crossroads. Samuel continued to push, suggesting that if Ryan truly wanted to be successful, he would have to sever his connection with John. Samuel was patient but insistent, framing it as the only logical way forward. "You can't have both, Ryan," Samuel told him, his voice almost soothing. "Your future's at stake. You can't let him hold you back." The words gnawed at Ryan, but as he sat there, torn between the life Samuel promised and the one he had with his father, something inside him shifted. This wasn't the life he wanted, not at the cost of losing his father. He called Samuel, his hand trembling as he dialed the number. "I can't do it," Ryan said, his voice steady but final. "I can't cut ties with my dad. I've made my decision. I don't need your money. I don't need you to dictate my future anymore." Samuel's silence on the other end of the line was almost deafening. Finally, he spoke, his tone low. "You're making a mistake, Ryan, a big one." Ryan ended the call before Samuel could say anything more. As he put the phone down, a wave of uncertainty washed over him. Had he made the right choice? Could his relationship with John ever truly be repaired? He didn't know, but he was willing to try. And as he walked back into the house, the weight of his decision heavy on his shoulders, he realized that while this might be the hardest choice he'd ever made, it was the one that could lead to a new beginning. but only if his father was willing to meet him halfway. Ryan stood in his small office, staring at the stacks of paperwork in front of him. His business was barely hanging on, and the weight of it was crushing. Every decision felt like a gamble, and the challenges seemed to grow by the day. Yet, despite the pressure, something in him had shifted. The call with Samuel, the one where he had rejected the offer for a lifeline, had been a turning point. He had chosen his own path, the one he had promised his father he would find. It wasn't going to be easy, but Ryan had finally realized that if he truly wanted to stand on his own, he had to earn it. His phone buzzed with an incoming message, a reminder from his business consultant about a critical meeting later in the week. Ryan sighed, rubbing his temples. He couldn't afford to ignore it, but part of him wished he could simply shut the world out for a moment. As he glanced out the window, the view of the bustling city felt distant, almost surreal. It felt like he was on the edge of something bigger than himself, a realization that he couldn't do it all alone. When John entered the office a few days later, it was clear that something had changed. He had been quiet, distant in recent weeks, but now his presence seemed different, less guarded. There was a glimmer of something resembling pride in his eyes when he looked at Ryan, but it was tempered by the remnants of hurt. "I heard about your decision," John said, his voice steady but carrying a weight of unspoken emotion. "Turning down Samuel's offer. I didn't expect that from you, but I'm glad you made the right choice." Ryan met his father's gaze, feeling the magnitude of the moment. He could still feel the sting of Samuel's offer, the temptation to fall back into old patterns, but rejecting it had been the hardest thing he'd ever done. And now, looking at his father, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. "It wasn't easy, Dad, but I know what I have to do now. I want to build something that's mine, but I want to do it the right way. With you, not with him." John nodded, his face softening slightly. "I'm proud of you, Ryan, but this is only the beginning. There's still a lot of work to do. You've got a long road ahead." The days that followed were a blur of long hours, sleepless nights, and tough decisions. Ryan's business continued to face obstacles, unexpected costs, difficulties with suppliers, and the constant pressure of not knowing whether it would all come together. But there was something different now. He wasn't looking for shortcuts or easy solutions. Each setback was met with a calm determination, a resolve to find a way through it. His approach was no longer impulsive, driven by a need to prove himself. It was methodical, measured. He was learning to lean into the process, not just the outcome. John noticed the change. He had been watching from the sidelines, unsure of how to engage, but slowly he started to offer advice. Subtle at first, recommendations on budgeting, thoughts on managing relationships with partners, but it was enough. Ryan was taking it in, applying it to his business in a way that felt like real growth. The shift in his son was undeniable. One night as they sat in the kitchen, the quiet between them felt less strained than it had in years. Ryan looked at John, his voice a little more humble than usual. "Dad, I've made a lot of mistakes. I treated you like you were just some obstacle in my way. I was too focused on what I thought was success, and I lost sight of what really matters." John's expression softened, but his words were guarded. "You've learned a lot the hard way, Ryan, but that's life. You can't undo the past. All you can do is move forward." Ryan nodded, the weight of his father's words sinking in. "I won't make the same mistakes again, I promise. I see now that family is more important than anything else. I'm sorry for everything." There was a pause, a moment of understanding passing between them. John, though still cautious, allowed himself a small smile. He could see it, the growth in his son, the maturity that had been so elusive before. But even in this moment of reconciliation, John knew it wasn't over. Trust had to be rebuilt, and the scars from the past would take time to heal. "We'll take it one step at a time," John said softly, the words carrying the weight of both hope and uncertainty. "But I'm willing to try if you are." Ryan met his father's gaze, a quiet promise in his eyes. They weren't there yet, but for the first time in a long while, John felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years: hope. And as they sat there in the silence that followed, John knew that while the road ahead would be difficult, It was one they would walk together. For now, that was enough. But deep down, he couldn't help but wonder, would this truly be the turning point, or would the past continue to haunt them both? Ryan leaned over his desk, eyes scanning the numbers once more. The familiar pressure of building a business from the ground up had returned, but this time, it didn't feel like the burden of failure. There was a shift in him now, a focus he hadn't known before. For the first time in years, he was fully committed to rebuilding both his business and his fractured relationship with his father. He had spent so much time trying to prove he could stand on his own, but now he realized that true strength came from accepting help and from the foundation of family. The first few weeks were a blur of long hours and late nights. Every decision, no matter how small, carried weight. Ryan was putting in the work, proving that his commitment wasn't just about words, it was about action. Every step forward felt like a victory, but it also came with a constant reminder. He still had a long way to go. John had been watching from the sideline, hesitant at first, but as Ryan's determination became clear, John began to involve him more in the decision-making process. It was a slow and careful process, one built on small steps. At first, Ryan didn't expect much, just a few decisions here and there. But as the days passed, John trusted him with more, allowing Ryan's opinions to shape the direction of the business. It was a subtle shift, but to Ryan it was everything. The trust that had been shattered was slowly starting to be rebuilt, one decision at a time. But not everyone was happy about the changes. Samuel, ever the shadow in Ryan's life, had begun to pull away as his influence waned. Ryan noticed it in the subtle ways. Samuel no longer called, no longer offered his advice, no longer tried to insert himself into Ryan's choices. The distance was palpable. Once, Ryan would have sought Samuel's approval, would have clung to the reassurance of his financial backing. But not anymore. For the first time, Ryan didn't feel the need to prove himself to someone else. He didn't need Samuel's validation to be proud of the work he was doing. Clara, who had been watching this transformation with cautious optimism, finally let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "I'm glad you're seeing the change in him, John," she said, her voice soft but carrying a weight of years. "But you need to remember, healing takes time. This isn't going to be an overnight fix." John didn't say anything at first. He just nodded, the silence between them filled with the understanding that they were both witnessing a change in Ryan, but it wasn't as simple as a flip of a switch. "I know," John finally said, his voice thoughtful, "but I can see it. He's different now." Ryan was different. There was a maturity in him now, a quiet reflection that had been missing before. Sitting with his father one evening as they discussed the future of the business, Ryan's voice was steady, his words carefully chosen. "I used to think that wealth was the answer to everything. I thought if I had enough, if I could prove myself, then all the problems would disappear. But I've learned that it's not about that. What really matters is the support I have. It's my family that's always been here for me, even when I didn't deserve it. I've taken that for granted." John looked at him, the familiar tightness in his chest easing just a little. There was pride in his eyes, but it was tempered with caution. "It's good to hear you say that," John replied, his voice low but sincere. "But you still have to show me, prove that you've really learned." Ryan no. Dead, understanding the weight of his father's words. "I will. I've learned what's important now, and I won't make the same mistakes again." Despite the progress, despite the way Ryan's business was finally starting to show signs of stability, John couldn't completely let go of his guard. There was still too much history between them, too much hurt that hadn't fully healed. He was proud of Ryan, proud of how far he'd come, but a small part of him remained wary. What if Ryan stumbled again? What if this newfound growth was just a phase? But for now, John allowed himself to feel the smallest flicker of pride. His son was working hard, rebuilding his business and his life. As for Ryan, now standing on more solid ground, he knew that the path forward wasn't just about financial success. It was about something deeper, something more enduring. "I'll always put my family first," Ryan promised, his voice steady but carrying the weight of his commitment. The legacy is about more than just money. It's about us. All of us. John met his son's gaze, the silent promise between them hanging in the air. But as he looked at Ryan, he knew that this wasn't the end of the journey. There would be more struggles, more challenges. The road to trust was long, and though the first steps had been taken, the hardest parts of their relationship were still to come. Ryan stared at the email in front of him, his heart racing. The numbers on the screen didn't add up. A major client had pulled out, and the resulting financial strain was enough to push his fledgling business to the brink of collapse. This wasn't just a setback, it was a crisis. Everything he had worked for could slip through his fingers in a matter of days. He ran a hand through his hair, feeling the pressure weigh on him, the weight of responsibility heavier than it had ever been. John had been watching from the sidelines, offering advice when needed. But this time, Ryan knew it was different. He had spent so long proving to himself and to his father that he could stand on his own. Now more than ever, he couldn't afford to fail. John entered the room, sensing the tension in the air. He could see the strain in Ryan's eyes, the same worry he'd seen in his own reflection countless times. "What's going on?" John asked, his voice steady, though a trace of concern slipped through. Ryan didn't look up immediately, his fingers hovering over the keyboard as if he could will the numbers into submission. He exhaled deeply before turning to face his father. "It's bad. The client pulled out and I'm in danger of losing everything. I don't know if I can fix this in time." John took a step forward, his voice firm. "You've been through worse, Ryan. You know I'm here to help. We can look at the books, figure out a strategy. I can offer some advice." Ryan felt a surge of pride, mixed with frustration. This wasn't a failure he could solve with a few words from his father. "I appreciate it, Dad, but I need to handle this on my own. I need to prove to myself that I can do this without falling back on your help." John stood still for a moment, his face a mixture of pride and worry. It was clear that Ryan had come a long way since their last conversation, but now there was a fear that lingered, one he couldn't shake. Would Ryan become too independent? Was he pushing away the very support that could save him, the same support that had always been there? "I get it," John finally said, though his tone was guarded. "But remember, you don't have to do this alone. I'm here if you need me." Ryan nodded, though the resolve in his eyes remained. "I know, I have to do this my way." As Ryan worked through the night, sending emails, calling potential clients, and exhausting every possible solution, the weight of the decision continued to hang over him. He had made it clear that he wasn't going to rely on Samuel's money, and he wasn't about to turn to his father now. This was his test. He had to prove that he could handle this challenge on his own. The next day, just as Ryan thought he might have found a solution, his phone buzzed. It was Samuel. The message was simple. "I've heard about the trouble you're in. I'm willing to help if you need it. Don't let pride get in the way." Ryan stared at the screen, his pulse quickening. The temptation was there. Samuel's offer was an easy way out, a quick fix to the problem. But Ryan remembered his promise to himself, to his father. He couldn't go back. He couldn't let Samuel pull him back into his orbit. With a deep breath, Ryan typed his response. "Thanks, but I've got it covered. I'll do this on my own." That evening, after hours of phone calls and scrambling to patch things together, Ryan finally found a solution, a compromise that salvaged the deal and secured enough revenue to keep the business afloat. The relief that washed over him was overwhelming. He had done it. He had faced the crisis head-on and emerged on the other side without falling CK on anyone else. When he told John, his father's pride was evident, but there was something else in his eyes too, something deeper. John could see the difference in his son's approach. It wasn't just the success of the moment. It was the maturity in the way Ryan had handled the pressure, the quiet determination to stand on his own. "I'm proud of you," John said quietly, his voice soft with a mix of relief and admiration. "You did it." Ryan nodded, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes. As he walked out of the office that night, a new thought lingered in his mind. He had finally proven he could stand on his own, and as he took another step toward independence, he felt the weight of a new decision settling in. His path forward would no longer be defined by his father's shadow. It was his time to carve out something that was truly his own, even if it meant leaving some things and some people behind. As the door clicked shut behind him, John watched from the window, his pride tempered with an unease he couldn't quite shake. Had he lost his son in this process, or was this simply the beginning of a new chapter? John sat by the window, the evening sky fading into deep shades of purple and orange. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy, as if the weight of time had settled over it. His thoughts were tangled, like a knot that he couldn't quite unravel. He was proud of Ryan, he knew that deep down, but there was also a pang in his chest that wouldn't go away. Ryan had made it. His business was thriving, his independence a hard-earned reality. But as John watched his son carve out a life of his own, a part of him couldn't shake the sadness that crept in. The business that had been their shared connection, the thing that had once tied them together, was no longer something they could bond over. Ryan had moved beyond it, beyond John's reach in ways he hadn't anticipated. He'd done what he set out to do. He had given Ryan the space to grow, to lead his own path. But now that path seemed to stretch too far ahead, leaving John on the sidelines, watching from afar as his son built a life he had no part in. There was pride in that, certainly, but there was also loss. Clara's voice interrupted his thoughts, soft but clear. "John, have you spoken to Ryan lately?" John turned to her, surprised by the question. "I talked to him, but not much lately. He's busy. He's got his own thing now." Clara sighed, her expression troubled. "I'm just worried. He's distancing himself more and more. I see it, John. He's successful, yes, but there's something else. He's isolated, and I think he's doing it on purpose." John felt a sting in his chest, but he couldn't deny what Clara was saying. He'd noticed it too, how Ryan seemed to be pulling away, not just from the business, but from the family. The phone calls had become less frequent, the visits shorter. The space between them was growing, and John didn't know how to bridge it. He had wanted Ryan to stand on his own, but now that it was happening, he wasn't sure if it had been the right decision. "I don't know what to do," John admitted, the frustration in his voice heavy. "I gave him the freedom to lead his own life, but now I'm wondering if I should have been more involved. Maybe I should have been more supportive. I don't know if I made the right choice." Clara reached out, placing her hand gently on his. "You did what you thought was best, but maybe we both need to realize that letting go doesn't mean losing him. We can still be there for him. He just has to find his own way." John nodded, but the uncertainty lingered. How much distance was too much? Was this just a phase, or had Ryan really outgrown the need for family? The questions swirled, unanswered, as the silence stretched on. That evening Ryan called. His voice sounded different, distant, but there was something else there too. Vulnerability. "Dad, can we talk?" John's heart skipped a beat. It had been weeks since they'd spoken like this, and a sudden wave of relief washed over him at the sound of Ryan's voice. "Of course, son. What's going on?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Ryan spoke again. "I don't know how to say this, but I feel lost, Dad. I've worked so hard to make my business a success, and I'm proud of what I've done. But I feel like I've lost something important. I've distanced myself from everything, especially you, and now it feels empty." John's chest tightened. It wasn't what he had expected to hear. "Ryan," he said softly, "I'm proud of you. You've done what you set out to do, but family is always here for you, no matter what." Ryan's voice softened, the weight of his words clear. "I know, Dad. I just needed to figure things out on my own. But I didn't realize how much I'd miss having you around, having the support of the family. I don't want to lose that." John paused, his heart swelling with both pride and relief. "You won't lose it, Ryan. You've grown. And I'm proud of the man you've become. But family will always be here. You don't have to do this alone." They both fell silent for a moment, and in that silence, John realized something. The path forward wasn't going to be easy. There would always be tension between their past and their present, between independence and connection. But the distance that had grown between them wasn't unbridgeable. They could still find their way back to each other. "I'll always be here, Ryan," John said finally, his voice firm but warm. "You lead your own path, but you don't have to walk it alone." Ryan's voice broke with a quiet, almost imperceptible sigh. "Thanks, Dad, I won't forget that." As the conversation ended and John put down the phone, he knew there was still a long road ahead. The future was uncertain, but they had taken the first step toward rebuilding what had been broken. And though John didn't have all the answers, he was willing to keep trying. Ryan stood in the middle of his new office, the walls bare but the space already buzzing with potential. It wasn't grand, not like the headquarters of his father's empire, but it was his. Every corner of this room, every desk, every decision was a testament to the path he had carved out on his own. He had done it. He had built something from the ground up, something uniquely his, using the lessons John had unknowingly taught him. Hard work, perseverance, the importance of family, but above all, the value of standing on your own 2 feet. The irony wasn't lost on Ryan. He had fought so hard to separate himself from his father's shadow, but now, in this quiet moment of success, he realized just how much he had learned from that very shadow. John had been right about so many things over the years, even if Ryan had been too proud to admit it at the time. The determination to succeed had always been there, but it was the steady foundation of values that had truly allowed him to build something meaningful. Ryan felt a deep satisfaction now, one that didn't come from simply achieving success, but from knowing that he had done it with integrity, on his own terms. John had stepped back. He was no longer involved in the day-to-day decisions of Ryan's business. That was something Ryan had insisted on, something he had fought for. But it was also something that had created an unspoken distance between them, a distance that was, at times, suffocating. John was proud of Ryan. He could see it in the way his father's eyes softened when they spoke, but he also respected Ryan's need for space. The old ways of their relationship weren't going to work anymore. They were both learning how to navigate this new dynamic. Clara, ever the voice of reason, had been the one to push them both to acknowledge the shift. "You've both come so far," she said one evening, sitting across from John, her eyes thoughtful. "But you can't keep pretending like everything is the same. You have to find a new way to be father and son. It's not about distance, it's about understanding each other in a new way." John listened to her, the words sinking in slowly. She was right, of course. He had spent so much time holding on to the past, to the way things had been, that he hadn't fully embraced the present. Ryan had his own business now, his own life, and that wasn't something to resent. It was something to be proud of. Ryan's success was undeniable. The business was thriving. But with each new milestone, a quiet realization settled in. No matter how far he had come, he was still part of something larger, something that came from his family, from his father. That connection could never be severed, no matter how many times he had tried to break free. The lessons John had instilled in him, the values of hard work, responsibility, and loyalty, were deeply ingrained. And Ryan knew now more than ever that his family's support, though sometimes distant, was the foundation of his success. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Ryan picked up the phone. It was a simple gesture, but one that had become rare in the years since he had truly struck out on his own. "Dad," he said, his voice steady but filled with something he hadn't expressed before. "I just wanted to say thank you for everything." John, on the other end of the line, was quiet for a moment before responding. "You don't have to thank me, Ryan. You've done this on your own." Ryan smiled, the truth of his words sinking in. "Maybe, but I wouldn't have gotten here without you." John's pride was evident, though it was tempered by the bittersweet knowledge that things could never go back to the way they were. The dynamic between them had shifted irreparably. But in that moment, John realized something. He didn't need Ryan to be under his shadow anymore. He was proud of the man Ryan had become, and that was enough. As Ryan hung up the phone, he leaned back in his chair, a quiet satisfaction settling over him. His success was his own, but the bond with his family, he loved, the support, the shared history, was something that would always remain. And as the future stretched out before him, he knew that, no matter where life took him, he would always have that foundation. But even as the weight of that realization comforted him, a part of him wondered, would this new chapter, this new legacy, truly bring the peace he had been searching for? Ryan stood in front of the mirror, straightening his shirt, his reflection staring back at him with a mix of nerves and pride. The evening ahead felt different, important in a way he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just any dinner. This was the first time in years that he'd invited his father to sit at the same table with him, not just as father and son, but as two people who had worked through their differences and found something resembling peace. His business had flourished, the weight of past mistakes slowly lifting, and now this dinner felt like the culmination of everything he had worked for. The road to this moment had been long, filled with missteps, betrayal, and tension. But tonight, there was something lighter in the air. "Dad, I'd like to invite you to dinner," Ryan had said over the phone earlier that day. "I want to celebrate, not just my business, but us. I think it's time." John's voice had been steady but tinged with something Ryan couldn't quite place. "I'd like that," John had said after a pause. "I think we both have a lot to be proud of." Now, as he glanced at his phone to check the time, he could hear the sound of footsteps approaching. He turned just as the door opened, his father stepping inside, a quiet but noticeable warmth in his eyes. Ryan could see the hesitation in John's posture, but there was also something else, a recognition of how far they had come. The years of anger, mistrust, and distance weren't gone, he knew that, but for the first time in a long while, Ryan felt the possibility of reconciliation. Clara and Ethan joined them shortly after. The family, once divided, was now together, gathered around a table that symbolized something far greater than just the food laid out in front of them. Clara, with her ever-present wisdom, smiled softly as she set the last dish down. Ethan, ever the quiet observer, offered his usual grin, a sign of the calm that had settled over the family in recent weeks. The tension was still there, but it felt manageable now, like a storm that had passed, leaving a stillness in its wake. The conversation began naturally, as if no time had passed, as if the years of conflict had never happened. Laughter floated through the air as they shared stories of the past, each memory tinged with a sense of nostalgia and newfound understanding. John found himself more engaged than he had been in ages. His face relaxed as he listened to Ryan talk about the business's growth, the challenges he had overcome. "I never thought we'd get here," Ryan admitted, his voice slightly more vulnerable than usual. "But I couldn't have done it without all of you. Without you, Dad. I know I've made mistakes, but you've always had my back, even when I didn't deserve it." John looked at his son for a long moment, pride swelling in his chest. Ryan had grown. He was no longer the brash, impulsive young man who had once pushed him away. He was grounded now, thoughtful, and John felt a deep sense of pride in who Ryan had become. "Just remember," John said, his voice steady, "success isn't just about what you've built. It's about the people you surround yourself with, and you've built something real." Ryan's eyes met his father's, a silent understanding passing between them. The years of tension, the struggles, the betrayals, they were still there, lingering in the background, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like they had both moved past it. The meal continued, the atmosphere warmer than it had been in years. They weren't just a family at the table, they were a family moving forward, taking steps toward healing. And as Ryan looked around at the people he loved, he realized that this moment, this dinner, was not just about celebrating his business. It was about the promise of a future where they could all be a part of each other's lives, not defined by their past mistakes, but by the strength of what they had built together. As the evening drew to a close, Ryan felt a sense of peace that he hadn't known in a long time. But as he stood up to clear the table, a quiet thought lingered in the back of his mind. Would this peace last? Or would the road ahead bring new challenges, ones they weren't ready for? John sat in his office, his gaze drifting out the window as he watched the world go by. It had been a long road to get here, but somehow he had made peace with the decisions he'd made, both in business and with his family. His relationship with Ryan had been fractured, torn apart by years of resentment and pride, but now they were in a place of quiet understanding. Ryan had carved out his own path, and John, though no longer directly involved in his business, had learned to accept that. In fact, he had come to find a kind of pride in it. Ryan's business was thriving, a testament to the hard work and sacrifices he'd made to get there. There was a stability in Ryan now, an ease that hadn't been there before. He had learned from the mistakes of the past, and his company was growing because of it. John watched from the sidelines, a silent supporter, offering advice only when it was asked for. He had learned the hard way that Ryan had to lead on his own. And now Ryan wasn't just leading his own venture. He was mentoring others, passing down the lessons he had learned along the way. John had been a part of that journey, even if indirectly. The core values, the work ethic, the importance of integrity, the strength to stand on your own, those were all lessons John had instilled in him. And it made him proud to see his son now teaching others what he had once been taught. As for Samuel, Ryan had learned to navigate the complexities of his past relationship with him. Samuel's influence still lingered, but Ryan had learned to distance himself, using the wisdom from both men to build a future that was uniquely his own. It wasn't about seeking approval anymore, not from Samuel or from John. Ryan was confident in his decisions, but he never lost sight of the lessons his father had taught him. Clara had watched the shift with quiet relief. She had always been the one to encourage patience, to remind them that time and understanding could heal wounds. And now, seeing John and Ryan interact, seeing them support each other in their respective ventures, it was clear that her belief had been right. The family was coming together, piece by piece, and it was a sight that brought a soft smile to her face. She had been there through all the pain and heartbreak, and now she saw the fruits of their labor, a family that, though scarred, was finally healing. Ethan, who had always been quieter, now spoke up with more frequency, his voice filled with pride. He had watched his father and brother struggle, but he had also watched them grow. And now he found himself expressing that pride, the words coming easily. "You both did it," he said one evening, the sincerity in his tone clear. "I'm proud of you guys. You've come a long way." John felt a warmth in his chest at his son's words, but the truth of them hit harder than expected. They had come a long way. And in that moment, John realized that the legacy he had fought for was never really about the money or the empire. It was about the lessons passed down, the values instilled, and the relationships nurtured. Those were the things that would outlast the business, outlast the years. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, John felt a peace settle over him. He looked at Ryan, at Clara, at Ethan, his family whole again despite everything. The road ahead was unclear, but they would walk it together. For the first time in years, John knew that no matter what came next, they had something far more valuable than wealth. They had each other. And that for now was enough.